I sat in the kitchen watching raindrops slide down the window. The water slowly blurred the world outside, and it felt as if the boundaries of my own reality were dissolving along with it. I couldn't remember the last time I felt something real. My husband's voice echoed from the living room, steady and familiar. He was on another work call, his tone professional, detached. It had become the soundtrack of my life. His voice through closed doors, his presence marked by absence. I knew every inflection, every pause, but none of it was meant for me. I ran my fingers along the rim of my coffee cup, the ceramic cool against my skin. The touch of anything physical, even this trivial, grounded me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I wondered if it was always going to be like this. Me on one side of the glass, life on the other. The front door creaked open and I turned my head slightly. His friend stood in the doorway, shaking rain from his jacket. He looked up, his eyes catching mine, and for a brief moment the house felt different. More alive. "Hey," he said, his voice warm, unforced. "I hope I'm not intruding." I shook my head, managing a small smile. "Not at all. Come in, get warm." He moved through the room with an ease my husband never had. He occupied space without apology, without hesitation. There was something both comforting and unsettling about it. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around the mug I offered him. His fingers, long and steady, traced the edge of the cup in the same absent-minded way I had just done. I found myself staring, drawn to the small, intimate gesture. "I missed this kind of rain," he said. "Back where I was, it's always dry. The kind of dry that makes you forget water exists." I nodded, not trusting my voice. There was a pull in his words, a weight that sat between us. It wasn't just about the rain, it was about absence, about need. He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving mine. "You look like you could use a change of scenery." I laughed softly, a sound that surprised even me. "You have no idea." He leaned back, his chair creaking. "Then let's make it happen. How about a drive? Just to clear the air." My instinct was to refuse. To fall back into the safety of my routine, to tell him I was busy, that I had things to do. But the words stuck in my throat. The truth was, I had nothing. No plans, no purpose. Just an endless loop of days that all felt the same. "What would you say if I told you I could get us lost for a while?" he asked, a smile playing on his lips. I hesitated, the air between us thickening. It felt dangerous, like the moment before a storm. I could say no. I could stay where I was, where nothing changed and nothing hurt. Or I could step outside, feel the rain on my skin, and let whatever happened next happen. "Okay," I heard myself say. "Let's get lost." His smile widened, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something stir inside me. Something fragile and reckless. Something I thought I had buried a lifetime ago. The drive was meant to be nothing more than a distraction. I told myself it was a chance to breathe, to escape the suffocating predictability of my life. The rain had thinned to a mist, the world outside the car window a watercolor of grays and greens. I sat in the passenger seat, my fingers curled into the soft leather, the warmth of the heater brushing my skin. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it held a weight that neither of us acknowledged. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually on the gear shift. His movements were unhurried, his presence so different from the rush of my everyday life. It felt like being inside a bubble separate from reality, where nothing needed to make sense. I let my thoughts wander, drift through the fog of my own mind. His voice broke through, low and deliberate. "You okay?" he asked, not turning his head. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, but there was an edge to his words, a softness that pulled at me. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I didn't trust myself to speak. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. There was something dangerous about this, and I wasn't sure if it was him or my own desires that made it so. We turned off the main road, the car rolling over gravel. Trees rose around us, their branches weaving into a canopy that shut out the sky. The world outside became a private cocoon, the air damp and tinged with the scent of pine. He slowed the car to a stop, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. I glanced at him, the question in my eyes. He leaned back, his hands resting on his thighs. The space between us seemed to shrink, the air thinning. I could feel his presence, the warmth of his body even with the space between us. It was as if he was everywhere. In the air I breathed, in the pulse of my own blood. "I used to come here when I needed to think," he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. It's a good place to be alone. His words hung between us and I knew what he meant. It was a place where the world couldn't reach us, where the weight of reality didn't press down. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my body sinking into the seat. My mind wandered, slipping into memories and half-formed fantasies. I wondered what it would be like to be truly seen, to be touched not out of routine but out of need. I felt a flush rise in my skin, a warmth that spread slowly, curling around my spine. He didn't move, didn't push. He just sat there, a steady presence, a quiet promise. I wanted to say something to break the tension, but my voice had abandoned me. All I could do was sit in the silence, let it wrap around me, let it pull me under. Then, with a slowness that felt deliberate, he turned to face me. His gaze was steady, the kind that saw through the layers, that reached the parts of me I kept hidden. I knew in that moment that he understood, that he saw the cracks in my facade, the fractures that I had tried so hard to mend. The car felt too small, the air too thick. My pulse quickened, my skin prickling with awareness. His hand moved, a small shift, his fingers brushing against mine where they rested on the console. The contact was brief, a spark that lit a fuse deep within me. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. My body felt heavy, weighted with a longing I hadn't realized I carried. His touch was a question, an invitation, and I found myself answering without words. I let my hand turn, my palm pressing against his. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid, grounding me even as my world tilted. He leaned closer, his breath a whisper against my skin. I felt the heat of him, the nearness of his body. My mind raced, 1,000 reasons to stop, to pull away. But none of them took root. All I could feel was the thrum of my own pulse, the ache that settled deep in my bones. When his lips touched mine, it was a gentle thing. Not a demand but a promise. His mouth was soft, his kiss unhurried. It wasn't about taking, it was about giving, about sharing something that words could never hold. My hands moved on their own, finding his shoulders, the curve of his neck. I pulled him closer, let myself sink into him, into the warmth and the want. Time slipped away, the world outside the car forgotten. There was only this moment, this breath, this touch. I felt alive, the kind of alive that came with risk, with the knowledge that every choice had a consequence. But in that kiss I found something I had lost. A piece of myself, a shard of truth that cut through the numbness. When we finally pulled apart, the air was different. Charged alive. He didn't speak and neither did I. Words would have broken the spell, would have forced us back into reality. Instead we sat in the stillness, our breathing the only sound. My mind raced, tangled with thoughts and fears. But beneath it all, a small voice whispered. It told me that this was only the beginning, that the line we had crossed could not be undone. And for the first time in a long while I felt something close to hope. The ride back home was steeped in silence, but not the kind that felt empty. It was thick, almost tangible, as if the air between us had learned to hold secrets. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, my fingers tracing invisible lines over the fabric of my dress. The feeling of his lips against mine lingered, a ghostly sensation that I couldn't shake. I wanted to press my fingers to my mouth, to hold on to that fleeting moment, but I didn't dare. The sky had cleared, and the road ahead stretched out like an unspoken promise. He drove with the same ease as before, his posture relaxed, but I could feel the tension beneath his calm exterior. I knew he felt it too, the shift, the way the world had turned a shade darker, richer. I wasn't sure if it was guilt or anticipation that gnawed at me, or perhaps both, tangled together in a knot just beneath my ribs. As we approached the house, my pulse quickened. I imagined the door opening, my husband's familiar face appearing, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. A reflex, a routine. I had spent years deciphering his every expression, learning to read him in the silence of our home. But now, every familiar detail felt sharp, edged with danger. The car rolled to a stop and I hesitated. My hand hovered over the door handle, the weight of reality pulling me back into its grasp. I could feel his gaze, a warmth against my skin, but I couldn't meet his eyes. Instead, I forced my body to move, to perform the motions of normalcy. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. He nodded, a subtle tilt of his head as if we had shared nothing more than a casual afternoon. His ability to slip back into his role unnerved me, a reminder that this was not new to him. I wondered how many times he had done this before, crossed a line only to step back into safety with practiced ease. I stepped out of the car, the cool air biting at my skin. My legs felt unsteady, as if the ground itself had turned soft beneath my feet. Each step toward the house was a test, a reminder that my world was made of fragile things, delicate threads that could unravel with a single pull. Inside the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled deep, filling every corner. I moved through the rooms, my fingers brushing over surfaces as if grounding myself. The kitchen, the living room, each space held the echo of my life, the remnants of days that had bled into each other. I paused at the window, watching the car pull away, the taillights disappearing into the distance. I couldn't stop the thoughts that rushed in, sharp and insistent. What had I done? What had I set in motion? I tried to gather the pieces to make sense of the chaos swirling inside me. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt him, his touch, his breath, the quiet promise in his kiss. I busied myself with small tasks, the kind that filled my hands but not my mind. I wiped the counter, arranged the mail, straightened the cushions on the couch. My movements were mechanical, a desperate attempt to anchor myself. But the house seemed to shift around me, the walls closing in, the air thickening. When my husband finally came home, the sound of his key in the lock sent a jolt through me. I turned too quickly, the smile on my face brittle. He stepped inside, his expression tired but warm, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both comforting and suffocating. "Hey," he said, dropping his bag by the door. "How was your day?" "Fine," I replied, the words sticking to my tongue. "Just quiet." He moved toward me, his arms wrapping around my waist, pulling me into a familiar embrace. I let myself sink into him, my cheek pressed against his chest. His heartbeat thumped steady, a rhythm that had once been my own. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe to match his cadence. But beneath the surface, my mind rebelled. I couldn't stop the comparisons, the way his touch felt different now. There was a gap, a distance I couldn't cross. His hands were warm, but they didn't ignite the same spark. His closeness was safe, predictable, and I felt a pang of guilt for wanting more. That night, as we lay in bed, his breathing slowed into sleep, I remained awake. The darkness pressed down on me, and I stared at the ceiling, counting the minutes. I thought of the kiss, of the way it had opened something inside me. A door, a window, something I couldn't close again. The moon cast shadows on the walls, soft and fleeting. I felt like one of those shadows, a wisp of something that had once been solid. I had spent so long being everything I was supposed to be, wife, partner, constant. And yet, in one brief stolen moment, I had felt more myself than I had in years. I knew I should be ashamed. I should feel the weight of betrayal, the sting of regret. But all I could think about was the way he had looked at me, the quiet invitation in his gaze. The way his touch had felt like a question, and how desperately I had wanted to answer. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, my dreams were tangled with whispers and shadows, a blur of faces and hands, of roads that led nowhere. And when the morning light crept in, pale and unyielding, I knew that something had changed. I wasn't the same woman I had been yesterday. And the truth of that settled over me, heavy and undeniable. The days that followed felt like walking through water. Everything around me moved in slow motion, the world muted as if wrapped in cotton. I went through the motions, waking up, making breakfast, folding laundry, each action an echo of the life I had built, but nothing felt real. I was an actress in my own home, reciting lines I had learned by heart, but without conviction. My husband noticed, of course. His questions were gentle at first, more curious than concerned. He asked if I was feeling well, if I needed a break, if maybe we should take a weekend away together. His words were kind, but they settled over me like a weight. I couldn't tell if he truly saw me or if he only saw the absence of who I used to be. I found myself avoiding his touch, shrinking from his embrace. His hands, once familiar and safe, now felt like reminders of the distance between us. He would reach for me in the morning, his fingers brushing my shoulder, and I would pull away, pretending to still be asleep. At night, I lay stiff beside him, counting the seconds until his breathing evened out, until I could slip into the quiet of my own thoughts. The memory of the kiss lingered, a splinter under my skin. I replayed it in my mind, dissecting every moment. The warmth of his lips, the quiet desperation in the way his hand had lingered on mine. I told myself it was a mistake, that it meant nothing. But no matter how often I whispered those lies to myself, they never took root. The truth was, I had felt something. Something dangerous and raw, something I couldn't control. When he came by the house again, I felt the air change. My senses sharpened, every sound more vivid, every movement more deliberate. He stepped inside, his presence filling the room, and I felt a pull and ache deep in my chest. I moved through the kitchen, my hands busy with dishes, my back to him. I needed to keep my distance, to hold on to whatever scraps of sanity I had left. But he didn't stay away. He moved closer, his steps soft on the tile. I could feel him behind me, the warmth of his body, the way the air seemed to shift around him. My fingers tightened around the edge of the sink, the porcelain cold and unforgiving. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low, careful. I didn't respond. My mind raced, searching for a safe path through the conversation. But there were no safe paths anymore. Only edges, only shadows. "I didn't mean to make things complicated," he continued. "If you want me to go, I will." His words hung between us, a lifeline and a threat. I knew what he was offering. A way out, a chance to step back from the edge. But I couldn't bring myself to take it. Instead, I turned, my movements slow, deliberate. I met his gaze, and I knew he could see the truth. We stood there, the room shrinking around us. His expression was open, vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. I wanted to reach out, to touch him, to see if the warmth of his skin could anchor me, pull me from the fog. But I didn't move. I stayed rooted in place, my body a battlefield of wanton guilt. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he hesitated, his own walls crumbling. It was a mirror of my own turmoil, a reflection of the line we had already crossed. Time seemed to stretch, the silence pressing in. And then, with a quiet exhale, he turned and walked away. The door clicked shut behind him, and the house exhaled, settling back into its familiar rhythm. I sank into the nearest chair, my body heavy, my mind spinning. I had expected relief, a sense of closure, but all I felt was loss. I wanted to call him back, to tell him that I didn't want him to go, but the words were trapped behind my teeth. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I moved through the house, my movements automatic, my mind a storm of half-formed thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of him walking away, the way his shoulders had slumped, the quiet resignation in his steps. When my husband came home that evening, I forced a smile, my lips stretching over the truth. He kissed me on the cheek, his touch a reminder of the life I had built, the life I was so close to unraveling. I let him hold me, his arms around me, and I closed my eyes, trying to breathe, trying to find a way back to myself. But the truth was, I was already gone. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The pull of the kiss, the ache of his absence. It was a thread woven into the fabric of my days, a quiet hum beneath every moment. I knew it was only a matter of time before that thread unraveled, before everything came undone. And part of me, the part one had tried so hard to silence, wanted nothing more than to watch it all fall apart. The days blurred into one another, a monotonous cycle of routines and rehearsed smiles. I moved through my life as if underwater, the world around me muffled and distorted. My husband's presence was a constant hum in the background, steady, reliable, but never quite touching me. His affection felt like an echo, a memory of something that used to be real. I couldn't bring myself to reach for him, to close the gap between us. Instead, I let the distance grow, a silent chasm filled with things unsaid. The memory of that kiss haunted me. It lingered in the quiet moments, slipping into my thoughts when I least expected it. I could still feel the warmth of his lips, the softness of his touch. It was a dangerous comfort, a reminder that there was still a part of me that could feel, that could want. I knew I should bury it, smother the flame before it burned through the life I had built. But I couldn't. It had become a pulse beneath my skin, a rhythm I couldn't ignore. I found myself looking for him, my eyes drawn to the door whenever it opened, my heart stuttering at the sound of his name. When he did appear, every nerve in my body seemed to hum with a low electric charge. His presence filled the room, a quiet disruption that pulled at me. I wanted to speak to him, to break the silence that had settled between us, but I didn't know how. Every word felt like a risk, every glance a step closer to the edge. And then one afternoon the opportunity presented itself. My husband had asked him to help with a small repair in the guest room, a leaky window that had been bothering us for months. It was an innocuous request, a favor between friends. But when he arrived, when his eyes met mine, the air shifted. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, and I knew that this moment held more weight than it should. I followed him upstairs, my steps careful, my breathing shallow. He moved with purpose, his hands steady as he inspected the window, his back to me. I stood in the doorway, my fingers curling around the frame, the wood cool and rough under my touch. I didn't know what to say, how to bridge the gap between us. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice low as if afraid to break the spell. I hesitated, the weight of his words settling over me. He was giving me an out, a chance to walk away, to keep the distance that had grown between us. But I didn't move. My feet remained rooted to the floor, my body drawn to him by a pull I couldn't resist. "I want to," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could catch them. He turned fully, his hands falling to his sides. His gaze held mine, steady and unflinching. There was no pretense, no walls between us. Just the raw truth laid bare in the space between breaths. We stood on the edge of something, a precipice I couldn't name. I felt the world narrow, the room fading into the background until there was only him, only us. My pulse thudded in my ears, a drumbeat that matched the rhythm of his breathing. And then he moved. Not a rush, not a lunge, just a quiet, deliberate step forward. I felt the air shift, the warmth of him reaching me before his hands did. His fingers brushed my cheek, a light touch that sent a shiver through me. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation wash over me, the quiet promise in his touch. When his lips met mine, it was like slipping into a dream. The world fell away, the weight of my life lifting for a brief, breathless moment. His kiss was different this time, softer, deeper. It wasn't just a touch. It was a conversation, a question and an answer wrapped into one. His hands cradled my face, his thumbs brushing over my skin, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a bloom of something tender and dangerous. We pulled apart slowly, our foreheads resting against each other, our breath mingling in the small space between us. His eyes searched mine, a silent question, and I nodded, the movement small but certain. He didn't speak, and neither did I. Words would have shattered the moment, dragged us back into the reality we were both trying to escape. Instead we stood there, suspended in time, the world outside the door a distant, muffled hum. I knew this couldn't last. I knew the walls of my life would close in, that the truth would find a way to the surface. But in that quiet room, with his hands warm against my skin, I allowed myself to believe in the possibility of more. When I finally pulled away, reality crept back in, filling the space with shadows and doubts. I smoothed my hair, my hands trembling, and forced myself to step back. His expression remained calm, but I could see the crack in his facade, the way his shoulders tensed, as if holding back the urge to close the distance again. I turned, my feet carrying me out of the room, down the stairs, and back into the life I had momentarily left behind. My husband's voice drifted through the house, a reminder of the lines I had crossed, the truths I had twisted. I forced a smile, my lips stretching over the ache in my chest, and slipped back into the role I knew so well. But beneath the surface I felt the shift. The pull of what I had tasted, the promise of what could be. And I knew, as much as I tried to bury it, that this was only the beginning. The next morning came with a weight I couldn't shake. The light filtered through the bedroom window, soft and golden, but I remained under the blankets, my body heavy, my mind a tangled mess. My husband moved around the room, his movements familiar and practiced. He showered, dressed, leaned over to kiss my forehead before leaving for work. I offered him a weak smile, a placeholder for the emotions I could no longer muster. When the door closed behind him, the house fell into silence. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts a blur of guilt and longing. The memory of yesterday sat like a stone in my chest, the quiet urgency of his kiss still fresh on my lips. I closed my eyes, the sensation rushing back, the way his hands had held my face, the warmth of his breath against my skin. I knew I should feel shame. I should be haunted by my betrayal, repulsed by the ease with which I had stepped over the line. But instead all I felt was an ache, a deep, persistent yearning that gnawed at me from the inside. It wasn't just him. It was what he represented. Freedom. Possibility. The chance to be seen, to be touched in a way that felt real. I forced myself out of bed, my feet finding the cold floor. I moved through the motions of my morning, my body on autopilot. Coffee. Breakfast. The clatter of dishes. I tried to fill the space around me with noise, to drown out the echo of my own thoughts. But every task felt hollow, every moment stretched thin. By midday I couldn't take the stillness anymore. I grabbed my keys and left the house, letting the door close behind me with a solid thud. The air outside was crisp, the sky a pale gray that seemed to press down on the earth. I walked without direction, my steps quick and unsteady. I needed to escape my own mind, to find something solid to hold on to. I ended up at the park, the same one we had walked through before. The paths were damp from the rain, the ground soft underfoot. I followed the winding trail, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The world around me felt muted, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. I sat on a bench, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. My fingers twisted together, the skin pale from the pressure. I didn't know how long I sat there, my mind running in circles, chasing shadows. I thought of my husband, of his steady presence, the way he moved through life with purpose. I thought of him, the way his eyes had found mine, the quiet promise in his touch. I was caught between two worlds, two versions of myself. The woman I was supposed to be, the wife, the partner, the constant. And the woman I had glimpsed in his arms, the one who could take risks, who could step into the unknown. I didn't know how to reconcile the two, how to find a path forward that didn't leave me fractured and lost. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a sharp vibration that jolted me back to the present. I pulled it out, my hands trembling, the screen glowing with a new message. His name stared back at me, a stark reminder of everything I was trying to push away. "Are you okay?" the message read. Simple. Direct. His concern seeped through the words, a lifeline in the grayness of my day. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could ignore it, let the silence stretch, build walls around myself until the ache dulled. But I didn't. Instead, I typed back, my fingers moving on their own. "I don't know." The response came almost immediately. "Do you want to talk?" I closed my eyes, the question hanging in the air. Did I want to talk? Did I want to open that door, to step back into the space where we had left off? I didn't have an answer. But my body did. I felt the pull, the need, the quiet longing that had settled deep in my bones. Yes. He suggested a coffee shop on the edge of town, a place tucked away from prying eyes. I agreed, my pulse quickening, a mix of fear and anticipation. I told myself it was just a conversation, a chance to find clarity, to set boundaries. But the truth lay beneath, raw and undeniable. I wanted to see him. I needed to. When I arrived, he was already there. He sat by the window, his hands wrapped around a cup, his posture relaxed but his expression serious. He looked up as I entered, his eyes finding mine, and I felt the air shift, the world narrowing until only he remained. I slid into the seat across from him, my movements careful. The table between us felt like both a barrier and a thread, something that could hold us together or keep us apart. He didn't speak, waiting for me to find my voice. "I don't know what I'm doing," I finally said, my words quiet but firm. "I feel like I'm falling and I don't know how to stop." His expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing over his face. "You don't have to have all the answers," he said. "Sometimes, it's okay to just feel lost." I looked down, my fingers tracing the edge of the cup. His words wrapped around me, a gentle pressure that eased the tightness in my chest. I wanted to tell him everything, to spill the tangled mess of my thoughts, to let him see the parts of me I kept hidden. But the words tangled in my throat, a knot I couldn't unravel. We sat in the quiet, the world moving around us, but I felt still, anchored in his presence. I didn't know what would happen next, how this story would end. But in that moment, with his gaze steady on mine, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time. The weekend arrived with a sense of unease. My husband had planned a trip, a quiet getaway to a lakeside cabin. It was meant to be a chance for us to reconnect, to find each other again away from the noise of our daily lives. He had invited him too, his friend, the man who had become more than just a shadow in my mind. The suggestion had been innocent, a way to fill the space, to avoid the silence that had grown between us. I packed slowly, folding clothes with hands that trembled, my mind a storm of contradictions. My husband moved through the house, his excitement palpable. He hummed to himself as he loaded the car, his good mood a sharp contrast to the weight pressing down on me. I wanted to match his energy, to reach for the life we had built together, but I felt hollow. I was a shell going through the motions, my heart elsewhere. When we set off, the car filled with soft music and the hum of the engine, I sat in the back seat, the landscape slipping past in a blur of green and gray. He sat in the front passenger seat, his posture relaxed, his gaze occasionally meeting mine in the rearview mirror. Each glance was a thread, a quiet pull that tightened with every mile. The cabin was nestled among trees, the lake a silver mirror beneath a sky heavy with clouds. It should have felt peaceful, a sanctuary from the world. But all I could feel was the pressure building, the anticipation coiling tight in my chest. I moved through the weekend in a haze, my actions detached, my mind elsewhere. Meals were shared around the wooden table, conversations drifting around me while I sat in silence. My husband spoke of plans, of future trips, of dreams that felt distant and faded. He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine, but his touch couldn't anchor me. I forced smiles, laughter, the kind that sounded right but felt wrong. When evening fell, the cabin grew quiet. My husband suggested a walk by the lake, but I pleaded a headache, the weight of the day pressing down on me. He hesitated, concern softening his expression, but he didn't push. He left, his footsteps fading into the night, and I stood by the window watching the darkness swallow him. The door creaked open behind me. I didn't turn, my reflection in the glass a ghostly silhouette. I knew it was him. I could feel his presence, the way the air seemed to thicken around him. My pulse quickened, a drumbeat in the silence. "You okay?" he asked, his voice a whisper in the dim light. I nodded, my throat tight. I didn't trust my voice. I could feel the space between us shrinking, the pull of him a quiet force. I wanted to move, to step away, but my body remained rooted to the spot. He came closer, his steps soft on the wooden floor. I could see him in the glass, his reflection merging with mine, a strange, beautiful distortion. His hand rose, hesitated, then settled on my shoulder, the warmth of his touch seeping through the fabric of my sweater. "I shouldn't have come," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. His fingers tightened, a gentle pressure. "If you want me to leave, I will." I turned to face him, the room spinning around me. His face was so close, his expression open, vulnerable. I could see the worry etched into his features, the quiet hope that mirrored my own. He wasn't just asking if I wanted him to leave the cabin. He was asking if I wanted him to leave my life. "No," I said, the word breaking like glass between us. "I don't want you to go." His shoulders relaxed, the tension easing from his body. He didn't move closer, didn't push. He simply waited, his presence a steady, unyielding thing. I felt a rush of gratitude, a warmth that spread through me, chasing away the cold. We stood in the quiet, the sounds of the night filtering through the open window, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. The world outside felt far away, a different reality. In that room with him, everything else faded into shadows. When he leaned in, it wasn't rushed. His lips met mine with a softness, a hesitation that made my breath catch. His kiss was a question, a quiet, desperate hope. I answered without words, my hands finding his, our fingers intertwining. I could feel his heartbeat, a steady rhythm that matched my own. Time slipped away, the room around us a blur. His touch was gentle, his movements slow, each moment stretched into eternity. I felt the weight of everything, the choices, the lies, the truths we had yet to speak. But in his arms, there was only this moment, a fragile, beautiful escape from the world. When we finally pulled apart, the air between us was different. It felt charged, alive, a promise unspoken. He didn't let go of my hand, his fingers warm and solid against mine. I knew the world would come crashing back, that reality would slip through the door and flood the room with harsh light. But for now, I held on to the darkness, the quiet, the possibility of something more. We stood there, the night pressing in, our hands still joined. I could hear the lake outside, the gentle lapping of water against the shore. The world had shifted and I wasn't sure where we would land. But I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The morning arrived wrapped in a gray mist, the lake a flat sheet of silver beyond the window. I lay in bed, my body pressed against the cool cotton sheets, my mind tangled in a web of half-formed thoughts. My husband's side of the bed was empty, the blanket still creased from where he had risen. I listened to the quiet of the cabin, the soft murmur of water against the shore, the distant hum of birds stirring in the trees. The weight of yesterday pressed down on me, a heavy shroud I couldn't shake. I closed my eyes, the memory of his touch still warm against my skin. It had been so quiet, so careful. The way his fingers had traced the curve of my hand, the soft brush of his lips against mine. The world had felt smaller then, the noise of my life slipping away until only he remained. But now, in the harsh light of morning, reality pressed against me. I could feel the edges of it, sharp and unyielding. My mind raced, cycling through the choices I had made, the lines I had crossed. There was no erasing it, no stepping back over the edge. I had opened a door and the path behind me had closed. I forced myself out of bed, my movements sluggish, my body heavy with the weight of my own choices. I wrapped myself in a sweater, the soft wool a small comfort against the chill. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I moved through the cabin, each sound a reminder of how fragile this moment was. In the kitchen I found my husband, his back to me as he stood at the stove. The smell of coffee filled the room, a familiar, grounding scent. His shoulders were relaxed, his movements slow and steady as he flipped pancakes, the morning light casting a soft glow around him. He turned when he heard me, his face breaking into a gentle smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm, unburdened. "Morning." My own voice sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I sat at the table, my hands wrapped around a mug, the ceramic cool against my skin. I watched him move through the small kitchen, the quiet rhythm of his actions a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I felt the gulf between us, a widening chasm that I couldn't cross. He placed a plate in front of me, the pancakes golden and perfect, a dollop of whipped cream on top. I managed a smile, a weak reflection of his own, and took a bite, the food turning to ash in my mouth. "Are you okay?" he asked, sitting across from me. His concern was genuine, his eyes soft, and it only deepened the ache in my chest. "Yeah," I lied, the words slipping out before I could stop it. "Just tired." He reached across the table, his hand warm against mine. I forced myself not to pull away, to hold on to the connection even as it felt like it might burn me. His touch was steady, a reminder of everything we had built, everything I stood to lose. The door opened and he walked in. His presence filled the room, the air shifting around him. He paused in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. His gaze found mine, a quiet question that neither of us spoke aloud. "Hey," he said, his voice slipping into the room, curling around us. "Everything okay?" My husband released my hand, turning to greet him, the ease of their friendship a knife in my side. I watched them interact, the familiarity of their exchange, and felt the walls close in around me. I was trapped between two worlds, two versions of myself, and I couldn't see a way out. The day stretched on, a blur of small moments, each one a reminder of the choices I had made. I moved through the hours in a daze, my body present but my mind lost in the fog. I caught his eyes across the room, felt the pull of him like a tide, and had to look away before it swallowed me whole. As the sun began to sink, casting long shadows over the lake, I found myself alone on the porch. The air was cool, the breeze brushing against my skin, a gentle reprieve from the heat of my own thoughts. I wrapped my arms around myself, holding tight as if I might unravel if I let go. I heard the door open, the soft scrape of shoes against the wood. I didn't turn. I knew it was him. His presence was a weight, a gravity I couldn't escape. He stood beside me, the silence between us thick and heavy. "We need to talk," he said, his voice a low murmur. I nodded, my throat tight. I couldn't find the words, couldn't push them past the lump that had lodged itself there. I felt raw, exposed, as if he could see straight through me to the broken pieces beneath. "I can't keep doing this," he continued, his words a careful thread. "Pretending. Hiding." I closed my eyes, the truth of his words sinking into me. I had wanted this, the escape, the rush, the taste of something new. But I hadn't thought about what came next, about the cracks that would spread, the damage that couldn't be undone. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice gentle, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that cut through the fog. I opened my eyes, the world a blur. I could see the water, the dark line where it met the sky, an endless horizon that seemed to stretch on forever. I wanted to say something, to find the answer he needed, but all I could feel was the pull of both worlds, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. "I don't know," I whispered. He let out a breath, a soft exhale that carried more weight than I could bear. His hand found mine, a tentative touch, and I clung to it, a lifeline in the storm. I knew the moment couldn't last, that the world would break through, that the choice I had been avoiding would find me. But for now, in the quiet, with his hand in mine and the lake stretching out before us, I let myself believe in the possibility of more. Even if it was just a whisper, a fleeting dream in the fading light. The drive back home was steeped in an uncomfortable silence. The road wound through gray landscapes, the sky a dull slate, reflecting the heaviness in my chest. My husband sat at the wheel, his hands steady, his expression a mask of calm. He had always been good at keeping the world at bay, holding his emotions in check, but I could feel the questions beneath his stillness. He glanced at me now and then, his eyes searching, but I kept my gaze fixed on the passing scenery. He was in the passenger seat, his presence a quiet weight. His posture was relaxed, his face turned slightly toward the window, but I knew he felt it too, the tension that wound through the car tightening with every mile. His hand rested on his knee, fingers tapping a slow, uneven rhythm. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but to me it spoke volumes. The weekend had passed in a blur of half-spoken words and stolen glances. I had drifted through the days, my body present but my mind elsewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling of inevitability, the sense that something was unraveling, that the life I had known was slipping through my fingers. I wanted to reach for something solid to anchor myself, but every time I tried, the ground seemed to shift beneath me. We pulled into the driveway, the house standing in quiet welcome. Looked the same as it always had, the same white shutters, the same garden beds, the same path leading to the door. But as I stepped out of the car, everything felt different. The air was thick, the sky pressing down, and I knew that nothing could return to what it had been. Inside, the house felt cold, the stillness amplifying the beat of my heart. My husband moved through the rooms, unpacking bags, his actions deliberate and practiced. He spoke in soft tones, commenting on the weather, on plans for the week, his words brushing over me without finding purchase. I nodded, responded when needed, but I couldn't shake the numbness that had settled over me. When he left for work the next morning, his goodbye was a soft murmur against my hair, a quick squeeze of my hand. I stood by the window watching his car disappear down the street, my breath fogging the glass. The world outside moved on, unaware of the storm that raged within me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands knotted in my lap. My phone rested on the blanket beside me, the screen dark, but I could feel its weight. I had scrolled through our messages earlier, my thumb brushing over his words, the quiet conversations we had shared. It felt like another life, a dream that had bled into reality. His message arrived just as the clock struck noon. The screen lit up, his name a soft glow in the dim room. It was a simple question: can we talk? My fingers moved on their own, typing out a response, a quiet yes that felt like a door creaking open. I didn't know what I would say, what I could say, but I needed to see him. To find something real among the ashes of my own confusion. We met at the park, the same one where it had all begun. The air was cool, the trees swaying gently, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. He stood by the bench, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression a careful blend of hope and caution. When he saw me, a small smile touched his lips, a fleeting curve that felt fragile and brave. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, his voice low, threading through the space between us. "I needed to," I replied, the words soft but steady. We sat side by side, the bench a solid line between us. I could feel the warmth of him, the quiet energy that seemed to radiate from his skin. My fingers itched to reach for him, to find solace in his touch, but I held back. The boundaries between us had thinned, but they still held thin strands of reality that kept the world in place. "I don't know where to go from here," I said finally, my voice catching on the truth. "I feel like I'm stuck, like I'm standing still while everything else moves around me." He nodded, his gaze steady. "I know the feeling. It's like you're outside your own life, watching it happen, and you can't find the door back in." I looked at him, the weight of his words settling over me. It was exactly that. A sense of disconnection, a quiet ache that threaded through every moment. I had spent so long being what everyone needed, molding myself into the shape of their expectations, that I had forgotten my own edges. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone careful, his question a thin blade. "I don't know," I admitted, the words falling between us. "I thought I did. I thought if I could just find a way to feel something, it would all make sense. But now..." He reached out, his hand covering mine, his touch a steady warmth. I didn't pull away. I let his presence ground me, the rhythm of his pulse a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone. "It's okay not to have all the answers," he said. Sometimes it's enough to just take the next step, even if you don't know where it's leading. The truth of his words wrapped around me, a soft tether that pulled me back from the edge. I didn't know what would happen next, how this story would end. But in that moment, with his hand on mine and the world moving softly around us, I felt a quiet sense of possibility. We sat there as the afternoon melted into evening, our silence a language of its own. The world outside the park moved on, the sun sinking into the horizon, the light slipping into shadows. But I remained in that moment, the edges of my life softening, the path ahead unfolding step by tentative step. And for the first time in a long while, I felt as if I had found the ground beneath my feet.